Mercedes 300 SL looked like a car that should not have existed so soon after the war. Europe was only just rising from the ruins. The Daimler-Benz factories had been largely destroyed, and the automotive world was trying to return to normal after years of conflict. In such circumstances, no reasonable person expected Mercedes-Benz to suddenly return to the greatest racing stages and build one of the most recognizable cars in history. And yet, that is exactly what happened. The 300 SL was not an ordinary sports coupe meant to look good in front of a hotel. Its story began on circuits and racing roads, and only later did it reach the streets. It was a car born from the need to rebuild the brand's honor, return to motorsport, and show the world that Mercedes could still create absolutely exceptional machines. First came the racing W194, then the road-going W198, known as the gullwing. The characteristic upward opening doors became a symbol of an entire era. But contrary to appearances, they were not created for effect. They were the consequence of an extremely light space frame, which required very high sills. That is exactly why the Mercedes 300 SL is so fascinating. Its beauty came from engineering, and its legend from racing. After the Second World War, Daimler-Benz was in a dramatic situation. A huge part of its factories had been destroyed, and the company had to plan every expense very carefully. Rebuilding the production of passenger and commercial vehicles was the priority, while motorsport seemed like a luxury Germany could not afford. Their technical power and prestige had been interrupted by the war, and a return to the top seemed unrealistic. In Europe, racing was slowly being reborn, often using pre-war designs or simple sports cars with small engines. In Germany, pre-war BMWs, constructions based on their components, the first Porsches, and various efforts by smaller manufacturers appeared on the tracks. Against this background, Mercedes could either remain on the sidelines or risk a spectacular comeback. The second path was chosen. There was no money, however, to create everything from scratch. That is why the idea for a new sports car had to combine ambition with pragmatism. Available components had to be used, but something had to be built from them that could compete with the best. That is how the road to the 300 SL began. The foundation of the project was the Mercedes 300, a luxury limousine later known as the Adenauer. It was from this car that the inline six-cylinder engine with a displacement of 3 liters came. In the road version, it was not a racing engine, but a solid unit intended for a prestigious upper-class car. For Mercedes engineers, however, it was a starting point. Rudolf Uhlenhaut, one of the most important people in the history of sporting Mercedes, understood perfectly that power alone could not win. A light, rigid, and aerodynamic car had to be built. Uhlenhaut was not only an engineer, but also an excellent test driver, which was extremely important. He could judge a car not only from the perspective of the drawing board, but also from the driver's seat. In the case of the 300 SL, his idea was to create a very light space frame made of thin tubes, arranged into triangular structures. Such a skeleton provided high rigidity, with minimal weight. The frame weighed only several dozen kilograms, and at the same time, it was strong enough to carry the loads of a racing car. It was a true breakthrough, and one of the most important elements of the entire construction. The first racing Mercedes 300 SL received the designation W194. The abbreviation SL was most often translated as super-light, meaning super light, and it is hard to find a better description of this car's philosophy. The engine came from the limousine, but it was heavily modified. To lower the bonnet line and reduce aerodynamic drag, the unit was tilted at a large angle to the left, and a dry sump lubrication system was used. Thanks to this, the engine could be mounted lower, and the front of the car could be more streamlined. In the racing version, 3 Solex carburetors, a modified camshaft, and many other changes were used. Power rose to around 175 horsepower, and later versions achieved even more. Today, that number does not make a huge impression, but it must be remembered that the car weighed around 1,000 kilograms, and the early 1950s were an entirely different era. A 4-speed manual gearbox sent power to the rear wheels, and top speed reached around 240 kilometers per hour. These were performance figures that placed the 300 SL among the fastest sports cars of its time. The most recognizable element of the 300 SL, the upward opening doors, was born out of necessity. The space frame was routed in such a way that it created very high sills. Cutting out classic, large door openings would have weakened the structure. The engineers, therefore, had to find another solution. Doors hinged in the roof, opening upward, were used. In the racing W194, at first they were relatively small and covered mainly the upper part of the body and the side windows. Later, in the road version, the openings were enlarged to make getting in easier, but a wide sill still had to be crossed. This solution gave the car the nickname gullwing. In France, it was called papillon, meaning butterfly. Interestingly, these doors were not a styling whim. They became a design icon precisely because they resulted from technical logic. The Mercedes 300 SL looked spectacular because it was subordinated to function. Its silhouette, low bonnet, long cabin, rounded body, and upward opening doors created the image of a car that looked like the future. The 1952 season turned out to be triumphant for Mercedes. The 300 SL immediately proved that it was not just an ambitious experiment. In the Mille Miglia, Carl Kling and Hans Klenk took second place, while Rudolf Caracciola and Kurla finished fourth. Then came a triple victory in the sports car race in Bern. The greatest success, however, was the 24-hour race at Le Mans. Hermann Lang and Fritz Ries won, and the second Mercedes took second place. It was a historic achievement because Mercedes was returning to the greatest stage of motorsport after years of absence, and immediately showed absolute effectiveness. At the Nürburgring, the 300 SL also dominated its rivals, taking the top positions. The culmination of the season was the Carrera Panamericana in Mexico, one of the most difficult and dangerous road races in the world. Carl Kling and Hans Klenk won despite a dramatic incident when a vulture struck the car's windscreen. The damaged windscreen did not stop the crew, and this story became one of the most famous episodes in the legend of the model. Mercedes was back, and it did so with a bang. The successes of the racing 300 SL quickly raised the question of whether such a car could reach customers. Max Hoffmann, the Austrian importer of Mercedes in the United States, played a key role. Hoffmann understood the American market perfectly and knew that wealthy customers overseas wanted something spectacular, fast, and prestigious. He convinced the Daimler-Benz board that a road-going version of the 300 SL would find buyers, especially in the USA. His arguments were so strong that Mercedes decided to prepare a production coupe. In February 1954, at the Sports Car Exhibition in New York, the Mercedes-Benz 300 SL of the W198 series was presented. Beside it, a smaller, more accessible 190 SL Roadster was also shown. The public was delighted. The gullwing looked like a car from another planet. It had upward opening doors, a low nose, a wide silhouette, and technology derived directly from racing. It was one of the first cars that could be called a road-going supercar. Not because it was only fast, but because it combined extreme performance, extraordinary technology, rarity, price, and an aura of absolute uniqueness. The road-going Mercedes 300 SL was a technological sensation of its time. Under its long bonnet sat the inline six-cylinder M198 engine with a displacement of 3 liters. The greatest revolution, however, was not the construction of the unit itself, but the fuel system used. The 300 SL became the first series-produced passenger car with a 4-stroke engine equipped with direct fuel injection. The solution came from Mercedes's aviation and racing experience. Thanks to it, power increased to around 215 horsepower, and torque reached around 275 Newton-meters. In the mid-1950s, these were impressive values. Depending on the rear axle ratio used, the car could accelerate to around 260 kilometers per hour. This made it the fastest series-produced road car in the world. Acceleration to 100 kilometers per hour took less than 10 seconds, and some test journalists managed to achieve even better results. It must be remembered that we are talking about an era in which most cars barely exceeded 130 kilometers per hour. The gullwing was therefore not only fast, it was shockingly fast. For many people, it represented a preview of the future of motoring. However, the true magic of the 300 SL did not come solely from its performance. The car drove completely differently from most luxury cars of the time. It was more racing car than grand tourer. The driver sat low, almost surrounded by the car's structure. Rear visibility was limited, and the cabin could heat up to very high temperatures. Getting in required climbing over wide sills and a kind of gymnastics. Even the tilting steering wheel was designed to make it easier to take a seat behind the wheel. On the road, the Mercedes demanded respect. The steering was direct, but required strength. The drum brakes were effective for their era, but by today's standards they required firm pressure. The swing rear axle could surprise the driver with sudden oversteer, especially during aggressive driving. This was not a car that forgave mistakes. The driver had to understand its character and respect the laws of physics. That is exactly why driving the gullwing was such a unique experience. Every kilometer reminded you that behind the wheel, you were sitting not in a luxury coupe, but in a civilized racing machine. Despite its demanding nature, the 300 SL quickly gained the status of an object of desire. A large part of sales went to the United States, where Max Hoffman was right about the model's potential. American customers fell in love with the extraordinary silhouette and performance of the Mercedes. Among the owners were actors, athletes, celebrities, and business people. The car was bought, among others, by Clark Gable, Sophia Loren, and Juan Manuel Fangio. The price was astronomical. In Germany, for one, Gullwing 1 could buy several Volkswagen Beetles or 2 large luxury-class Mercedes cars. For most people, it was absolutely unattainable. Paradoxically, that only increased its appeal. The 300 SL was not a car for everyone. It was a symbol of success, modernity, and prestige. At the same time, it was not an empty status symbol. Every element of its construction recalled its racing pedigree. Customers were buying a car that was almost directly derived from a machine that had won Le Mans and the Carrera Panamericana. Such authenticity was extremely rare even then. Between 1954 and 1957, exactly 1,400 Gullwing coupe examples were built. Most received steel bodies, with aluminum bonnets, doors, and trunk lids. 29 cars were made almost entirely of aluminum, making them even lighter, and today they are among the most sought-after examples in the world. One experimental car was also built with a body made of fiberglass reinforced plastic. In 1957, coupe production came to an end, and its place was taken by the 300 SL Roadster. Thanks to a modification of the space frame, it was possible to use conventional doors and lower the height of the sills. The Roadster was more comfortable in everyday use, received improved rear suspension, and later, also disc brakes. It was produced until 1963. In total, 1,858 Roadsters were built. Together, this gives 3,258 cars of the W198 series. That is very few for a model that wrote itself into the history of the entire automotive world. Why is the Mercedes 300 SL so valuable today? There are several reasons. First, it was a pioneer of technology. As the first series-produced car with direct fuel injection, it was decades ahead of its time. Second, its construction came directly from racing. Unlike many later sports cars, it was not styled to look like a racing car. It truly was one. Third, it captivated with its design. Even people not interested in motoring recognized the characteristic gullwing doors. They are one of the most iconic elements in the history of automotive design. Finally, it was extremely rare. Even when new, it was an exclusive car. And today, the number of surviving examples is obviously even smaller. For collectors, matching engine and body numbers, service history, and originality are of enormous importance. Cars after poor restorations or heavily modified examples are valued much less than cars preserved in original condition. In the classic car world, authenticity today means millions. And how much can a Mercedes 300 SL be worth today? The answer depends on the version, history, and condition of the specific example. Good cars regularly achieve prices exceeding €1 million. Very well-preserved gullwing coupe examples often cost from €1.5 to even €3 million. The rarest aluminum versions are even more expensive. In recent years, there have been sales exceeding $6 million. Particularly exceptional cars, connected with important events or possessing unusual history, can achieve even higher amounts. A perfect example was the last gullwing produced, known as the Last One, which became a true star of collector auctions. Roadsters are usually slightly cheaper than coupes, but they also belong to the very top tier of the most valuable classic Mercedes cars. Today, the 300 SL is not only a car, it is a collector asset, a work of industrial art, and a symbol of an entire era. The Mercedes 300 SL is an icon of motoring because it perfectly combined the worlds of racing, engineering, and beauty. It was created at a time when manufacturers built sports cars primarily to win. Only later did they discover that they could also sell them to customers. Every line of the body, every construction decision, and every technical element had a specific justification. The gullwing doors were not decoration. They were created because of the space frame. The low bonnet resulted from the tilted engine. Fuel injection served performance. Aerodynamics mattered more than fashion. Thanks to this, Mercedes created a car that, even after 70 years, does not look like a relic of the past. It still arouses emotion, attracts attention, and inspires admiration. The 300 SL is not a legend because it is old and expensive. It is a legend because it represents a moment in automotive history when the courage of engineers mattered more than marketing calculations. It is a car that proved technology can be beautiful, and beauty can be born from function. And that is exactly why the Mercedes-Benz 300 SL Gullwing remains one of the most important cars ever made.